Hello, and welcome to our AGO at Home Close Look series, today with a focus on untraditional materials and conservation. My name is Nadia Abraham, and I'm an interpretive planner at the AGO.
And my name is Sjoukje from Laan. I'm the Assistant Conservator Contemporary Art.
Great. And Sjoukje, if you want to just move on to the next slide. So we're not, the two of us are at our homes. We're not actually at the AGO today, but the artwork that we are talking about lives at the AGO. So we thought we would include a land acknowledgement. So the land the AGO is on is Mississauga Anishinaabe territory, Mississauga. It is also governed by a treaty between the Mississauga the Credit and the Canadian government. Toronto is Mississauga Anishinaabe territory. It has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat confederacies. All right, so now we're just going to dive right into the discussion. Right, so the work that we're looking at here is Ron Benner, Canadian artist Ron Benner's Anthro-Apologies, and the trees grew inward for Manuel Scorza. Spring isn't here quite yet, but it is in the air, and this work is very much fitting for the season of regeneration. And the last time we exhibited it at the AGO was in 2017 in our curator Wanda Nanabush's show, Toronto Tributes and Tributaries. So I'll just provide a very brief background on the artist Ron Benner. He lives and works in London, Ontario. He is known for his mixed media installations, and for decades, he has been exploring the history and politics of food. He utilizes food crops and plants to create thought-provoking works, and many of his installations are actually site-specific, so they're directly tied to the place and land he works on. And another really interesting thing about him, and it definitely comes across in his work, is that he is a gardener himself. He has quite the green thumb. And research is a major part of his process. The photographs and plant species he includes in his installations trace back the colonial history and militarization of food, as well as the economic and aesthetic values of these goods. And when he first made and exhibited this work in 1979/1980, food wasn't a super common material found in art installations. So what was the inspiration behind this particular work? At the time, he was living in Lima, Peru, and Benner found himself fascinated by the diversity of agricultural produce. He said he visited a market in Lima called La Parada, and when he was there, he collected all the various types of corn, seeds, and a really diverse selection of plant species and brought them back to Canada. And the title of the work, very poetic sounding title, is loosely based on a quote from a novel by a Peruvian writer named Manuel Scorza called The Tomb of Lightning. And Benner actually met Scorza in 1980 when the latter was running for vice president of Peru. So I think that should do it for a little bit of background. Sjoukje, if you want to tell us what we're looking at, what are some of the materials that we're seeing here?
Yeah, so this is a very large installation, and what you see here are four really large photographs. Two are hanging on the wall, and the hands are like this, and two are laying on the floor, and the hands are like this. And on the floor's photographs, there's a massive pile of fruit and vegetables placed, and this pile, it's all fresh fruit and vegetables, and this pile is allowed to deteriorate over the course of the exhibition. And then in front of the photographs, you see all sorts of stuff. Like this installation has many different kind of materials. And yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of things going on. So in front of the photographs, there are two mantas, so that are the two textiles where all dried seeds and dried nuts are placed on top of it. There are newspaper clippings, there are wooden spoons, there are little objects, there are coins and banknotes. So there's money. And yeah, this is also installed in a way as almost like a marketplace. So you can almost imagine that if you go to Peru, to a market there, that this is a way of someone presenting their goods. And that's the way it is presented.
Great, thank you. And as we touched on earlier, in terms of the meaning of this artwork, food is central to Ron Benner's practice, and food is something that a lot of us take for granted day to day, but it's a massively political economy. Food quality, production, security, and unfortunately, food is the cause of anxiety for many communities across the globe. And there is a quote by US Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, who was in his position in the 1970s, where he said, "Food is a weapon," which is a very loaded quote, but actually makes a lot of sense in the context of food politics. And another interesting thing about Benner is that he is really interested in mapping out the dissemination and hybridization of food crops. So there's, for example, maize, also known as corn, is a Native American crop that is now everywhere. So Sjoukje, can you expand a bit more on the value of food and the categories that food falls into? The values?
Yes, because I think, and this is also, I spoke with Ron about this as well, and I think you can attach like 3 sorts of value to food. And first of all, and most important, is that food is our crop that feeds us. I mean, we cannot live or survive if we don't have food. So food as a first life necessity. And second, you can see food as, or food has also its medicinal value. So even think about, for example, ginger that you can get nowadays everywhere in the supermarkets. We eat it, but it definitely has also medicinal value to it. And then the third value is aesthetical. So think about autumn, when we put all the pumpkins out, because we think it looks beautiful and nice and inviting, but eventually it's a pumpkin that you can eat, but we are using it for its aesthetical value at that point.
Yes, very true. And the interesting thing too to think about is that even capitalist developed countries like here in Canada, we see shifts in food costs and security constantly, depending on the global economy. And capitalism really does structurally create an imbalance of food production. And one of the current examples that has been in the news is the farmer protests in India. And with the new laws implemented by the Indian government, farmers are fearing for their livelihoods. And there is a worry that only big agriculture will benefit. And the artist himself traveled to India a number of times to conduct research too. So in this vein, Sjoukje, what does the artwork tell us about the necessity of food?
I think to me, this artwork really represents that the moment that food is capitalized on, which is happening these days, and this is also what is happening already for decades or maybe centuries, is that there is a massive imbalance occurring about people profiting on food and people who actually need food. And I think this artwork represents that once you hang a corporate value towards food, that on the other hand, food literally can rot away. And in this case, this installation shows that food literally rots away in the hands of the farmer. And an important thing also is to mention is that the newspaper clippings that are around in this installation are all clippings from a Peruvian newspaper called Amauta, and it are all articles about violence that happened against indigenous people and farmers at that time, showing already that this is not it's not something that we only see nowadays. And I think that is why this artwork is also so extremely powerful, because it's now over 40 years old. It's still like its message is still so accurate and so important, that the imbalance of people having access to food is it's present everywhere. And what you say, like here in Canada, we take it often for granted because most of us have access to food we don't have to stress about it, but that's globally definitely not the case.
Yes, exactly. Maybe we can move on to the next slide and we can talk a bit more about the details.
Yeah, so I added these two photos to this presentation because I thought it was, first of all, a good insight of how we, from a conservation point of view, approach an installation like this. So these are two shots from our installation instructions, and the labels that you see here are just for our own documentation to know what exactly is placed everywhere in the installation. So also we created these installation instructions also for our future colleagues so that they know how to install this installation. And on the left side, you see a detailed photo of one of the mantas where you can see all the different newspapers laid around and how the seeds and nuts are placed on the newspapers. And there are objects like spoons and dried corn, but there are also coins and money. And on the right side, you see the detail of the pile of fresh fruit and vegetables that is placed on top of the photographs. And you can see in this pile, like you can see the pineapples and strawberries, corn, pumpkins. It's all like common fruit and vegetables that you can pretty much find everywhere in the world, I think, right now.
Excellent. So we can go on to the next slide and we could talk about the installation from 1995. And you can tell us a little bit about how previous AGO conservators approach this artwork.
Yeah, because with contemporary art, especially with an art installation like this, it is, if you compare it with traditional art forms, so if you compare it with a painting or a bronze, this is definitely something completely different. And especially because fruit and vegetables, like biologic material, is added to the installation. So in 1995, when this work was still recently young, my previous colleagues tried to document the process of decay of the pile of fruit and vegetables on the photographs. And I think this is also done to sort of show later generations to how it showed how like this process of decay and deterioration is kind of going. And I think it's just a very interesting thing, because I find this in the artworks conservation file, and for me it is an indication like, oh yeah, that deterioration is something that needs to happen, but it's definitely not something like, I won't use these photos for the installation to exactly replicate where every pineapple or every pumpkin has to lay, but I think it's more an really great documentation of how deterioration happens, and also how previous colleagues approach this work, because it's so new, and especially with contemporary art, it's yeah, you have to start approaching it a little bit different than any other traditional art forms.
Absolutely, and it's just fascinating to see the change in the installation from the first image, which was June 5th, to the last image, which is July 31st, 1995. And it almost appears as though the installation has shrunk, which is the deterioration and decay of the natural elements. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, we can go on to the next one, talk a little bit more about some condition images.
Yeah, because I added these 3 photographs. The left one is a detailed photo of one of the newspapers, and the 2 right photos are detailed photos of the large photographs that are laying on the floor, so where the pile of fruit and vegetables are laid on top. And you can see that the deterioration of the fruit and vegetables actually affects the original materials of the artwork. And this is an interesting dilemma that we are dealing with this artwork, because on one side, deterioration is part of the artwork's concept, but on the other side, the deterioration as a concept also affects its own physical materials. So in this case, it's really like the discussion in finding the balance of the artwork concept, but also preserving the artwork's original materials, because as a conservator, that is what we always reach for, is to conserve or preserve the artwork in its original way. And yeah, so it's an extremely interesting balance to find in this case, how far you let the deterioration happen without like losing its original materials.
Right, because the newspapers, as we mentioned earlier, are very specific newspapers that he selected from indigenous Peruvians. And it's important that be legible to some degree. So if the ooze or the detritus from the decaying plants and fruits sort of blurs the message too much, what are the steps that you take in conservation to fix that?
Well, in this case, it's we are in the process of documenting everything that is in the installation. So for example, with the newspapers, we are photo documenting all the newspapers in a high resolution. So in case if something gets lost in the future, and if text is not readable anymore, then at least we have a file on hand that we can replicate the old newspaper, or at least we know how the newspaper, what kind of message it contained. So documentation is definitely the key in preserving this piece.
Right. And how much of the photograph needs to be affected before the photographs are replaced?
So, and this is also an amazing tool. Well, let's say it's a tool with contemporary art conservation, because often we can still speak with the artist. And in this case, when this artwork was last installed in 2017, we had the opportunity to talk with Ron, and we talked about the possibility that the deterioration of the fruit and vegetables eventually would affect the photographs in such a degree that you cannot read the photographs as such. And Ron said that if 75% of the image of the photograph's image is lost, then we have the ability to reproduce the photographs. And right now we also we have the files on hand. So in case in the future, if we need to replicate these photos, we are able to. And yeah, so that's something that right now, although the installation is still presentable in the way it is, and we are definitely not at that point yet that anything is not readable as such. We have to think about that. What if this installation is, let's say, installed for another 10 times or 15 times in the future, and we and my future colleagues are reaching that point of this installation is kind of lost, then at least we have the opinion of the artist, and we have the right files on hand to move forward, and this installation won't get lost at that point.
Yeah, it's a really interesting difference between preserving, because your job as a conservator is to preserve the artwork, but as you said, with contemporary art, it's often about preserving the concept. So in this case, deterioration is part of the concept, but it also you can only allow it to go so far without affecting some of the other components of the artwork, like the message, for example, and the images. So,
yeah,
very interesting. All right, we can wrap this up, and I can ask you, what is the future of an installation like this, Sjoukje, from your very specific conservation point of view? What do you see for the future of this artwork?
I spoke with Ron about this as well, that with an artwork like this, especially if there's living or biological materials included in the artwork, it's a challenge to preserve and conserve it, also its concept and its materials. And we are very fortunate at the HGO that we have a big team of specialists and talent that can work and think about this. So we have a conservation team that, for example, if I'm working on an installation like this, it's not only me, it's also the curators and the art installers and anyone involved in the process that helps with preserving this artwork and its concept. And right now, we are in the process also of thinking of how we can, for the next time when this artwork is installed again, like how can we think about even to slow down the deterioration of the photographs. So because the fruit and vegetables are placed directly on the photographs, but we are thinking about maybe we can slow down like the deterioration of the actual photographs by catching as much of the juices that come out of the strawberries and the raspberries and the bananas and the pineapples as much as we can by like absorbent pads, and those will be like visible and invisible and extremely small. So as a visitor, you cannot see it. But there are a couple of these tricks that you can use to preserve the original materials as much as you can. And I think having an artwork like this in the HGO's collection, it is for me, I find it a really great challenge and really fun to work on, and really great to talk about. Like even the discussion we have now, I think it's such a great piece, and it comes like both its concept and its message, but also the conservation dilemmas comes with it. You can talk about it forever, pretty much.
Yes, and I think it's fascinating how your current team in contemporary conservation is building on top of the learnings from the 1995 team. So they took a lot of documentation of the decay. You are now focusing more on slowing it down, like what you mentioned with the absorbent, probably custom absorbent pads that you place under the fruits and vegetables. That's probably not something that they were discussing in 1995, but who knows, maybe in the next 100 years, there'll be a whole new technology system to help our work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and that is also how, as a conservator, you sort of approach a piece like this, like what you look at what your colleagues did in the past and what you can do now, and also provide as much information as you can for the future generations to work with this piece. Because I think, especially with contemporary art installations, especially like this is a perfect example of it as well, is that you just cannot, how do you say, fix the installation as it is right now. It's impossible because of its materials. It will constantly change, and that is something you have to work with and find a balance on how much change is possible, and also if change still affects the concept of the artwork.
Yeah, it's a living artwork. So in that sense, it's continuously, it will evolve and it will change. And something you and I had discussed earlier was whether some of the fruits and vegetables and materials that we're seeing here will even be in mass production in however many years in the future.
Exactly.
So the change in the plant economy, it's all part of the work at the end of the day.
And maybe if that happens, maybe that even makes the message of this artwork even stronger. I don't know. It's definitely interesting to think about, like, what if in 50 years there are no pineapples anymore, because who knows what happens, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that adds another textural layer to the message that the artist was, grappling with when he first came up with this artwork.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great talk. Thank you so much for sharing some behind the scenes secrets and working with food as an art material. Is there anything else you want to say before we say goodbye?
No, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope
Me too.
everyone did.
I hope so too. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you another time. We'll talk more for sure.
For sure. Bye.
Bye.